Hello, YouTube. I am Compound Fracture, and it is time for the live screen Chatterbox for today. Well, something happened this morning that I happened to catch before I started my stream, and I want to share it with all of you. You see, Portland, of course, has been in the news all year, and another thing has happened in Portland. There's this place called the Red House there, and it's owned by a family of Afro-Indigenous people, an Afro-Indigenous family, who have, for the entire year throughout the protests, they've been doing what they can to help out. They allow homeless people to pitch tents next to their house and shelter them from the elements as best they can. They serve meals to the community. They've offered shelter when the riot cops have attacked protesters. And in general, they've just been incredible to all their neighbors. They've helped everyone. Unfortunately, the cops came in today and kicked them out of their house. Now, the backstory to this is, I'm sure everyone knows about the subprime mortgages prior to the 2008 economic crash. And they got caught up in that subprime mortgage stuff that so many people got caught up in. Despite having lived in this house for 65 years, the family has, it's a multi-generational house. In 2004, they refinanced their mortgage. And of course, we all remember 2004, at least those of us who are old enough to remember that. There were ads all over the TV saying, you know, refinance your mortgage, save tons of money. It's easy, it's easy, it's easy. And a lot of people did, even if maybe the mortgage companies sold them down the river more than a little bit. So fast forward to 2 years ago, October 2018, they owed only $97,000 on this mortgage, but their house was taken by the bank for that amount because it had been sold from the initial mortgage broker to a trust and then on to a Goldman Sachs subsidiary, an investment corporation that wanted to milk the house for everything they could. So they were able, on the basis of that $97,000, to take the entire house and sell it to the highest bidder, except that they denied the family the right to buy it back, which is a pretty common practice, as it turns out. So this has been going on for a while. This has been challenged in the courts that they didn't have the right to buy it back, and the court case was still going through, but earlier this year, the bank came in and they decided to foreclose immediately, despite the fact that the case was still going through. So there's a bit of a history to this. Now, this family came to escape Southern racism from Oklahoma, I believe. I think it says so in this story. Let's double check. They came from... Oh, well, maybe we shouldn't have double checked. Little Rock, Arkansas. There we go. They came from Arkansas to escape the Deep South and all the racism. But Oregon has its own particular type of racism, which has caused it to have a very small black population. And it's particularly gross in a lot of ways. Until 1926, it was illegal for any people of African descent, any black people, to own property in Oregon. And there was an attempt to keep black people out of Oregon. So this is relevant when you consider that this family arrived only 30 years after these laws were repealed. They settled in what had become a black community, and that black community has been pushed out piece by piece. Now, normally the cops and the banks are not quite so aggressive in pushing a family out. But as you might imagine, when when this family, like wonderful, wonderful people by all accounts, do things like what they're talking about on their Twitter here, this is their house's Twitter account, and we go back, we see calls to action, we see a call to action today because of what happened today. And then as we continue down, we see work that they're doing to respond to, okay, here we go, to prevent the city from clearing out a homeless camp, a tent city. We see places where they are helping to get people's stuff moved as their camp is being cleared out. We see lower down where they're retweeting the People's Store about centering a community's needs. That these are activists. This is a house full of activists. And as you might imagine, the Portland Police Department is not a big fan of activists at the moment. So as you might imagine, they were pretty damn intense about it. Here is, in fact, what happened in September.
I managed to, talk to them. I walked around and opened the door, and then they just all came rushing in with the guns drawn, and I actually have some film of that as well. So that happened. We had a conversation for at least 15 minutes about what's going on, and we still don't have the paperwork, but one of the officers was like, the paperwork's right here, and swinging a whole list of papers that we didn't get no notice of until the actual moment. When we originally had it, we had a stay in place, and we weren't notified that the stay was revoked, and we were we were in the process of having
So the police came in, guns drawn, pointed it at the owners of this house, whose family had lived there for 60 years, 55 years, whatever. It was longer than that, 65 years. And they hadn't been served papers. The police gave them papers as they were pointing guns at them, telling them to get out. And then today, of course, they did it again. So the community today came out in support of this family. And this was the scene. You had the police bottling people in the alleyway. Oops. Come on back. And if we go a little bit ahead here, they're pushing people into the car, they're pepper spraying. But people wouldn't back down. So because people wouldn't back down, the cops were eventually forced themselves to back off. And they did somewhere around here, I think.
Okay? Did nobody get hurt during that?
This is the cops now having backed off to the neighboring street. So, and they're up here as well. But that wasn't it. After a while of sitting down at the end of this alleyway, this is about an hour later, it's a little over an hour later, the cops decided to come back. They came back up.
This is gonna be neighborhood. I can't get any closer.
But this time, people were ready. This time, people pushed the cops straight back down the hill, right away. This time, the police were not able to kettle the neighborhood. And they were pushed, and they were pushed, and they were pushed.
Fucking back up.
And then pretty quickly after that,
It feels like the JC again.
they were being chased. The neighborhood came out in defense of the family, and the cops went running. Now, immediately after this happened, people gathered around. They put up barricades, 3 sets of barricades in the street. They took the fences that had surrounded the house that were put up to keep the family out, and instead built these barricades to occupy the house and allow the family to stay in. So that happened today in Portland. That was this morning. That was 5 hours ago, this video. But I want to talk a little bit more about these type of tactics, and I want to talk a little bit more because we see in the national news and in the international news recently, we see often people talking about how there is this extreme violence in Portland. We see people talk as if this is unprecedented, that people would chase cops away. You see, we talk about the difference between cops and protesters in the sense that only one of these two sides, only the cops and not the protesters, are allowed to have an absolute monopoly on violence. The cops can be as violent as they want, but protesters must always be 100% peaceful. And those protesters were not 100% peaceful, the ones we just saw. They were pretty damn close. They were not assaulting the police. They were not hurting anybody. Not at all. But they were smashing things into the cars. They were chasing. They were intimidating the cops until they backed off. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of conflict escalation here. Now, this is the Wikipedia article on conflict escalation. And here we have the U.S. Marine Corps' idea of continuum of force, right? So if we were talking about a standoff or a battle between police and protesters as a battle with two sides, which it absolutely is a battle with two sides and two sides facing off against each other, then we'd start talking about who is using more force and about who is the one doing the escalating. Because if we talk about any other form of battle, like say it's a schoolyard battle, one guy is punching someone else in the face and the other one just kind of shoves him away. You don't turn around and say, well, you shouldn't have shoved him away. No, because these are different levels of force being used. So the police consistently throughout the year in Portland, they've been more or less around level 4. They haven't used, in fact, exactly at level 4. They have not used lethal force, although, I mean, a non-lethal round, if it hits the right spot, can be pretty awful and potentially deadly. But they've certainly used strikes, kicks, pain compliance. What do you think tear gas is other than pain compliance? Impact weapons, absolutely. They have billy clubs. You saw that one cop going with his club. That's yeah. Meanwhile, protesters have typically been in number 2, passive resistant. Protesters almost entirely have not tried to combat or in any way attack the cops. They have simply refused to back down. That's level 2. Occasionally, a protester might hit level 3, and we saw a little bit of that. We saw a little bit of pushing the cops back, soft-handed blows. There was certainly no joint manipulation or pressure points on the cops, but yeah, sometimes the protesters have gone to level 3 throughout this year in Portland, but they haven't even for a second touched level 4. So we can't pretend in any way that there is any sort of equivalence between the protesters pushing and chasing cops back as they were doing and what the cops had done to them. However, this hasn't always been the case in history. In fact, there's been a lot of battles in a lot of even wealthy countries, even countries similar to America, where the protesters respond with equal force back to the police. This has not happened this year. There has been no equal force from the protesters. We should be clear about that. That's why we say over and over again it's a peaceful protest. Even this is a peaceful protest. The level of force being used by the protesters is nothing compared to what's being used upon them. But let's go overseas. Let's go to Britain. See, there was a law introduced by Margaret Thatcher called the poll tax. And what the poll tax was a flat tax that would be applied to everybody, regardless of how much money they had. It was regressive taxation. It was not the same percentage no matter what your income is. It was the same amount no matter what your income is. So this BBC retrospective had a little thing here, a little way of explaining it, where they talked about how pensioners, here we go. So this person, Jones and his wife here, were in their 70s, living on modest pensions, and under the poll tax, they would have been paying more than twice as much tax as they had previously paid. This was a tax that focused on the poor. And there was a campaign against the poll tax, and the campaign against the poll tax was about non-payment. People, not just individuals, but whole communities, refused to pay this regressive tax. And the government responded by revoking their homes, by evicting people, by kicking them out of social housing, by kicking them out of the only house they'd known for a very long time. And that did not go well for the government. It was a very similar scene to what we saw in Portland this morning, where a community came together to defend families' right to live in their houses against the government coming in. I'm going to take another little step back to where we started this, and that's with the subprime mortgage crisis. We can, it's a very, very convenient thing for us to say, well, they owed money, they defaulted on their mortgages, they're clearly at fault. But that's been a very small part of a massive society-wide problem in the United States ever since the subprime mortgage crisis. People were sold down this river of being told that yeah, you can refinance your mortgage. And these people had a mortgage for a long time, but it was refinanced to be a mortgage that can be snapped back. It was refinanced into a subprime fixed rate mortgage. And in fact, it was snapped back. In fact, their house was taken from them when they owed only a relatively small portion of the value of the house. The rest of the value is just gone. The banks took it. It's awful, and it should be criminal, and it's only allowed because a financial deregulation by the American government. It shouldn't be allowed. It's wrong. So anyway, it's wrong just like the poll tax is. So what happened with the poll tax? This happened. This started with people, in particular in Scotland, defending their neighbors, and it continued into fires. I'm not going to play this whole 25-minute video, certainly, but you can find this on the internet. You can find plenty of video footage of the poll tax campaign. It's all over the place. Let's see what we can find here. Here's an image of cops running over protesters with horses. And in the end, people fought back. We see people fight back against the police all over the place. We see these people, look at that guy, he's ready to fight. This is not something unusual. What the media is trying to paint Portland as is some exception. It's this anarchist city. It's this city that is out of control. It's unique. It's not unique. People defending themselves against police assaults and defending their communities against having their houses taken away has happened over and over again throughout history. It's not unusual. It's called being a decent neighbor and a decent person. It's called standing up for yourself and your community against government repression. It's the type of thing that America was founded on. It's the type of thing that patriots look back to in America. And it's the type of thing that the same people who are trying to take away the right to protest seem to believe that they're defending. Which is real gross, if you ask me. So I'm going to leave you with one last thing. Everyone has seen Martin Luther King's quote that the riot is the language of the unheard. But what I really want to do is focus on the end of this.
Riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
It's that last sentence. Social justice and progress are the preventers of riots. Not people deciding not to, because it's not about people deciding to defend themselves. It's not about people deciding to attack police or something like that. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I wish I'd pulled that up on my screen here, but I didn't. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a really interesting idea. It's the idea that, you know, first you take care of food and water, and then the second one after food and water, after sustenance, is shelter. Shelter is incredibly important. You can't overestimate the importance of shelter. And we live in a society right now where a whole lot of people do not have shelter, are not given the right to shelter, where banks can trick families to take the houses that the family has lived in for more than half a century. And it really shows what this is when you look at how this particular family has sheltered homeless people for years in Portland. Other people with no houses have been able to rely on staying at this house because of the generosity of the people living in it. And where are they going to go now? To the tent city? Except the tent city got broken up. That's why they had to defend the tent city, because it's gone. And I'm sure it's reestablished itself. Tent cities are inevitable. They will always reestablish themselves. But this story, this is a tragedy. And I'm certain, I haven't read the news reports yet because I started streaming today not long after this happened. But I'm certain we'll see Fox News and other right-wing outlets talk about the violent Portland protesters and show clips similar to the one I just showed of them chasing police away and say, look how horrible Portland is. Look how violent Portland is. I say, look how violent America is when it takes people's houses, when it allows finance companies to trick people into signing documents that give them the right to steal shelter from people. So I guess that's all I have to say about that. Good night.